Hello, my name is Zora Aziz. I'm an Equal Justice Fellow at GAIN, and this is my colleague Amir Naeem. And we are going to be doing this presentation on what to expect during your asylum interview. And this presentation is intended for anyone who is going into their interview and also any stakeholders who need to prepare Afghans or any other asylees for their asylum interviews. Okay. We're just going to go to the next slide. Okay. So we're going to just start off with a brief overview of what is an asylum interview. So essentially the interview is just a way that the government is going to evaluate your asylum case. So you meet with an asylum officer in an office, and they will ask you several questions about your case. Their questions will vary from very basic biographical ones to questions about the details of your story, about the reason why you're applying for asylum. And these interviews can generally last really between 2 to 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours would be kind of on the high end. So some tips on how to prepare for the interview. So it's always important to review your application and to review your affidavit. One of the most important things that the asylum officer wants to see is consistency between what you're telling them and what's written in your application. If they see any inconsistency, that can result in the denial of your case. If you do see a mistake or any wrong information in your application, it's good to bring that up to the officer as soon as possible, as soon as you notice it, because if you don't and you wait for them to bring it up, then that's kind of a red flag for them. They may think that you were not being truthful. Also, another way to prepare is to check to see if you need an interpreter. So USCIS is currently providing interpreters for the asylum interviews, but you need to make sure that your language is offered by USCIS for interpretation. And you just need to check your notice to make sure that you have that settled. If not, you might need to bring your own interpreter, or you might need to request an interpreter from USCIS if they haven't arranged that. And finally, you want to make sure to bring your original documents that you submitted, if that's possible. Okay. So how to prepare for the interview. So bring everyone who is on your application to the interview. The other thing is to make sure that you're well rested and you're well fed. Like we mentioned before, these interviews last a very long time, a lot of the day. So you want to make sure that you don't get tired during the interview, because that can affect your performance. You can even bring a snack to eat during breaks from the interview. The officer might allow a break and then you can have your snack. Know how to get to the USCIS office. So best practice is to make sure that you arrive 30 minutes before your interview time to give you time to go through security and any other, traffic or anything like that. So make sure that you know how far the office is from your office, and you know what time you have to leave in order to make it there 30 minutes before your interview time. Also, make sure that you dress appropriately for the interview. The standard is business casual. And you can be comfortable, but just make sure that it's business casual clothing. And make sure that you bring a mask, because masks are still required. Okay, and I'm gonna let Amir take it away from here on what to expect at the interview.
Okay, so when you arrive at the USCIS office, you'll park your car and you'll go inside. There's the first thing you have to do is you have to go through security. And so they're not going to let you bring your phone or any like electronic devices like a laptop or anything like that with you. into the interview. So you should make sure you have a plan for that. Either you leave it in the car, or if you got a ride from somebody, you leave it with them. So you're ready to go through security. When you show up at security, they're going to ask to see your ID. And also to see your appointment notice. So that's how they know that nobody's allowed inside the building unless they have an appointment to be there. So you want to make sure that you have your ID. I think most people should have their EAD, their work permit, as an ID or a driver's license. So you can use that, and then also your appointment notice that has the time of your interview and stuff like that. After you go through the security checkpoint, you go through a metal detector and everything, and then there's a desk after that where you check in. So again, you're going to show them your interview notice, and they'll put a note in the system that that you arrived and that you're waiting, and then they'll send you to the waiting room to wait for the officer to call you in. Next slide, please. So when the officer is ready to see you, they'll call you into their office, and they'll ask you questions about your case. The questions are, the point of the interview is to decide whether or not you're eligible for asylum. So this is like the main thing that they're going to focus on when they're making a decision about your case. And they'll ask you lots of questions. Like Zora said, the interview can be several hours long. During the interview, the officer, they have a computer in front of them, and they'll be taking notes on the computer. That's also normal. It's not something to be worried about, but they take pretty detailed notes about what questions they asked and what answers they got from you. And the interpreter, as long as USCIS is providing interpreters, those interpreters will be on the phone. So they're not there in person, they're just on the phone, and they'll be translating everything that you say word for word into English and translating everything that the officer says word for word into your language, as the case may be. So maybe the biggest thing that you're wondering about is what kind of questions the officer is going to ask. So I want to try and give you a little bit of an idea about that. Each officer has a very different interview style, and there isn't like a standard list of questions that the officer is going to ask you. But in general, most officers go through a certain order in the way that they ask the questions, although they don't have to. So usually the first thing that the officer will do is that they'll swear you in. So they'll make you stand up and raise your right hand and say that everything that you say is going to be the truth. After that, the next thing that most officers will do is go over the information on the I-589 form. So that's the biographical information, things like, what's your full name? Have you ever used any other names? Where were you born? What are your family members' names? The different places you've lived, or the different jobs that you've had. Where you went to school, all those kinds of things. It's on the first, I think, 4 or 5 pages of the I-589 form. So those are supposed to be like easy questions. They're meant to get you to relax a little bit. Make sure you know the answers, but for the most part, they're pretty straightforward questions. And so once the officer is done with that, then after that, they go into the specifics of your story. So they'll ask you more specific questions about what happened to you in Afghanistan, and it's going to be very different depending on your case, right? So for example, some people may have worked for the Afghan government, so they may ask you questions about what kind of job you did, what your duties were. If you got any threats, they might ask you what kind of threats you received, and detailed questions about that. Like, did somebody hand you a letter, or did you get a phone call? These kinds of things. So it's important to make sure, like Zora said, that you reviewed the statement that you wrote, or that you wrote with the help of somebody else. Just to make sure that what's in there, and you can answer the questions in a consistent way with what's in there, and if there's a difference, to be able to explain the difference. And then after the officer has gone through your story with you, and that's usually the longest part of the interview, they will usually ask a few sort of standard questions at the end that are related to bars to asylum. So these will be questions about, have you ever been involved in a terrorist organization? Have you ever been arrested? Have you ever committed a crime or persecuted other people? Things like that. That part of the interview is standard questions. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the officer thinks that you've done any of those things, but they are questions that usually get asked at the end of the interview. One last thing I wanted to add. Sorry, if you can go back. That wasn't on the slide. But another thing that the officers ask usually at the beginning of the interview is about how you prepared your asylum application, or who helped you. These questions can be a little bit, I don't know, I think they can be a little bit off-putting. People maybe get nervous when they hear these questions because they sound kind of weird. But it's mostly just questions like, who wrote your statement? How did you write your statement? Did somebody help you? All of those kinds of things. And so, again, those are like normal questions to ask. It doesn't mean that the officer thinks that there's something suspicious about your case. But just answer them, honestly. If you went to the clinic, you could say, "Oh, I went to a clinic that was organized by the resettlement agency, and somebody there, took down my story in English, right, or something like that." So whatever the case is, don't be off-put by those questions. I guess. Sorry, go on. I think it's the slide before this.
The tips for the interview.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So just a few things to keep in mind about as far as tips for the interview go. It's very important to speak clearly and in short sentences, especially if you're using an interpreter. Because the interpreter, especially if they're over the phone, their job is to repeat exactly what you say word for word, right? They're not explaining anything to the officer. They're not telling the officer, "Oh yeah, I know about this thing. This really does happen in Afghanistan." Nothing like that. They're literally just saying the words that you are saying in English. So it's important to speak clearly and use short sentences and keep that in mind, right? The officer might not know anything about Afghanistan. They may not know where it is on a map. They may have never met anybody from Afghanistan before. So even things that you think are obvious or like common sense or that everybody should know, the officer might not know that. So make sure that you're explaining it. And that you're using short sentences and breaking it up. If you need to if the answer is a longer answer and you need to keep talking, that's okay. But just give a pause for the interpreter to be able to translate what you're saying. If at any point you think that the interpreter is translating things incorrectly, or if you aren't understanding properly what the interpreter is saying, for whatever reason, they have an accent or they speak a different dialect from you, or the phone connection isn't good, please let the officer know right away. It's really, really important that the officer is aware of any problems with the interpretation. What they'll probably do is just get a different interpreter. They have, a phone service that they can get a different interpreter on the line very easily. And so it's important to do that because later on, the interview isn't being recorded usually. And so later on, if you're like, "Oh, I didn't say that," and the officer says, "Oh no, he said that," there's no way to show that, "Oh no, actually the interpreter interpreted it wrong." It's very difficult to show that afterwards. So it's important to bring that up. And don't be worried about offending the interpreter or, creating a problem. It's okay. They interpret for lots of people and, you're not always going to be able to understand what the interpreter is saying. So if there's a problem, definitely let the officer know.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize, Amir, the whole breaking up your story portion of what you said. It's really important to do that when you are using an interpreter, because if you don't and you go on for 1 to 2 minutes talking about what happened, I understand that this is a really emotional, interview. You can be reliving what happened to you. But when you don't break up what you're saying, the interpreter will end up summarizing what your story is. They won't remember everything that you say unless they're taking notes really quickly on their end, and you won't be able to see if they're doing that or not. So you don't want them to end up summarizing what you're saying and then maybe accidentally or unintentionally misinterpreting your story. That might have bad consequences for your case. Maybe they will diminish by accident what happened, not emphasize certain words enough. So it's really, really important to break down what you say, be as concise as possible. If it's not possible to just say it within, like a minute or a sentence or anything, break it down. That's all. Thanks.
Yes. No. Yeah, I know Zora has interpreted for people before. I've interpreted for people before, and it's very difficult to, keep up, especially if the interpreter hasn't heard your story before, so they have no idea what you're going to say, and so it's hard to anticipate it. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the next step is just if you're not sure of an answer, don't guess. So if the officer asks you a question that's really specific and you don't know for sure what the answer is, don't guess. It's better to say that you're not sure or you don't know. That's usually okay. If you don't remember the exact date that something happened, for example, or exactly how many people were there, or something like that. If you're not sure, don't guess. And the reason is just that later on they might ask you the same question again and you might not remember what your guess was, and so that'll be an inconsistency, or maybe you'll just you'll be guessing wrong, and then it'll turn out like, oh no, actually now we know that it was actually on this date and not that date, and then that causes a problem with credibility. And if the officer doesn't believe you, they're not going to grant your case. So it's important to be careful about that. And I guess like the last thing is just make sure you understand, at least in general, like the basis for your asylum claim. You can see that by looking at the I-589 that was filled out. On page 5, I believe there have like different boxes that are checked, that'll say like, I'm asking for asylum because of my political opinion or because of my race or because of my religion. So make sure you have like an understanding of that. I think that'll be helpful for you to understand where the officer is coming from when they're asking certain questions, right? So for example, if your case is because you used to work for the Afghan government, right? That's going to be a political opinion case, most likely, right? So you're saying that I'm afraid to go back to Afghanistan because the Taliban are going to hurt me because I have a different political opinion from them, right? And so just knowing that ahead of time will help you understand where the officer is coming from, right? Or somebody might have a case, maybe they're part of a religious minority or an ethnic minority, and they're afraid of being targeted because of that. So just knowing that will help you, I think, maybe not be surprised or help you anticipate a little bit what kinds of things the officer is asking and why they're asking those things. Okay, yeah, so this is sort of the last like little sort of tip or what might happen at the interview type thing. So in some cases, the officer, so usually what happens at the interview is the officer is just asking questions, and then they're taking notes themselves on their computer about what questions they asked and what your answers were. Sometimes the officers want to take an actual verbatim statement from you, right? So they will ask you, they might ask you a series of questions about a particular issue and write down your exact answers, and then have you look at it and sign it, right? Or they might record you. That's also possible. That doesn't usually happen, but it's a thing that could happen, so you should know. If that does happen, where they're taking like an actual verbatim statement from you and you're reading it and signing it, make sure that you really, if you sign it, make sure you really understand what's written there. If you do not understand everything that's in there and you're not 100% sure that everything in there is complete and accurate and correct, don't sign it. Often they're asking you to sign this thing because they think there might be an issue in the case and they want to make sure that they have like the correct information when they're making a decision. So just be careful about that. Don't sign anything if you're not 100% sure that it's exactly right and complete. If they have you sign a written statement, you have a right to get a copy of that statement. You can ask the officer for a copy. If the officer doesn't want to give you a copy of the statement, ask for a supervisor because they're required to give you a copy of the statement. And that can be very important for you in the future. If they ask for more evidence, or if they say we want to deny your case because of A, B, or C reason, it'll be very helpful for you if you have a copy of the statement. It's very difficult to get the copy later. It's much easier to get it when you're there in the interview in the USCIS office. So they are required to give you a copy of the statement. If something like that happens, if your interview is recorded, if they ask you to sign like a written statement about different things in your case, or if there's more than one officer in the interview, or anything like that, definitely let the resettlement agency know, let IRC know when the interview is over that happened, so that they can sort of maybe give you a little bit of advice about like what you might want to think about or what your next steps are.
Amir, do you think that if the applicant's attorney is not in the room with them, can they not sign and then ask if they can speak to their attorney before signing?
Yeah, that's an option. So if you're not, if you don't feel confident, that you understand exactly what's written on the statement, for example, and you don't feel comfortable signing, it's okay to say I'm not going to sign. I'm not sure that I understand this right. I want to talk to an attorney, or I want to talk to whatever it is. So yeah, that's an option that you have.
Okay, so I'm just briefly going to go over what will happen after the asylum interview. So you will not get a decision about your asylum application on the day of the interview. Usually the decision is going to have to be reviewed by higher level officials. And you will actually receive your decision in the mail after your interview. And there are a few things that you might get in the mail. There's the first is a request for additional evidence, or an RFE. The next is a notice of intent to deny, or we call that annoyed. And the last is just an approval, and I think it's a notice of intent to approve. The request for additional evidence or the NOID will happen if the asylum office does not have enough information to be able to accept your asylum claim, to grant it. And then they may also ask you to attend a second asylum interview to be a little bit more thorough about your case. They may ask you to bring additional documents as well. Please let the IRC know if you receive any of those things. There will probably be a time frame in which you have to respond to those notices, and we want to make sure that you guys meet the deadline. So it's really important to flag the notice to the IRC or whoever is your designated, person who's assisting you with this, whether that's the IRC or an attorney or something. Okay, I think that's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and we hope this information was helpful to you all. Thank you, Amir, for giving us the bulk of the information.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a good experience with their interview and a positive result in their case.